Paul and the Corinthians, and indeed the whole early Christian church, faced challenges that seem foreign to us. The church grew up a tiny minority within established cultures, whether Jewish culture, as the church did in and around Jerusalem, or Greek and Roman culture, as the church did in most of the rest of the world. As the church began to spread and to chart its own course in the world, it had to think about how it should relate to the cultural and even religious norms around them. One of those norms in the Roman Empire was buying meat in the marketplace, meat that had been offered as sacrifices to the Roman or Greek gods. Could Christians buy and eat such meat? Paul's answer may surprise you. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. And this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, March 26th, 2025. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is relatively brief, but it is pretty subtle in the way Paul answers a ticklish question. Animal sacrifice was a common part of worship in much of the Roman Empire among both Jews as well as most Greeks and Romans. It was so common a practice that it was as much a cultural practice as it was a religious practice. But the meat sacrificed to the gods was treated differently in different places. Meat sacrificed at the temple in Jerusalem was either burned completely in a fire or eaten by the Levites, the priestly class. This wasn't because the Levites were greedy. It was part of established Jewish law and custom, since the Levites, alone among the tribes, were not allotted any land, but were supported by the monetary offerings and the animal sacrifices at the temple, at least until the temple was destroyed. In the rest of the Roman world, however, animal sacrifices were usually handled differently. As in Jerusalem, some of the meat would have been burned entirely. What remained, however, could be sold in the local meat markets, where shoppers came day in and day out to buy food to feed their families. This is an instance where the line between religious practice and cultural practice blurred. The meat had been part of a religious practice, but buying it for one's family table was clearly a cultural practice, largely unrelated to the religious significance of the sacrifice itself. In the matter of whether or not one can eat meat sacrificed to other gods, Paul saw immediately that the relevant issue at stake wasn't the meat, but the problem of spiritual pride, the problem of people in the Christian community who believed themselves superior to others because of their higher level of intellectual sophistication. They reasoned correctly, as Paul says, that there are no other gods, and therefore eating meat sacrificed to these non-gods wasn't a religious issue at all. But that's where Paul's agreement with them ended. Their unwritten premise was that matters like this were matters of personal choice. That's the premise that Paul eviscerates in the section of 1 Corinthians 8 that I want to read now. Referring to their argument, he says, "It is not everyone who has this knowledge. Since some have become so accustomed to idols until now, they still think of the food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled." Quote, "Food will not bring us close to God," end quote. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do, but take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if others see you, who possess knowledge, eating in the temple of an idol, might they not, since their conscience is weak, be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food is a cause of their failing, I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall. Paul says, in effect, you may be correct that eating meat sacrificed to idols doesn't implicate you in the worship of other gods, but that's not really the point. The point is the unity of the fragile Christian community. The fact is, says Paul, There are others in the community who are scandalized by the eating of this kind of meat, believing, rightly or wrongly, that simply eating this meat does indeed implicate them in the worship of those gods. Yes, you intellectual snobs, you may be technically right on this point of theology and practice, but in insisting on your way, you are threatening the fragile unity of the church. You may technically be right as a matter of belief or theology, but you are dead wrong as a matter of practice. The tricky thing here is that Paul recognized plenty of instances where Christians may disagree and still be part of the church. For example, we've seen earlier that the question of whether or not to marry was a matter over which Christians could disagree and still remain within the fellowship of the church. But in this matter, as with several others, Paul insists on unity of practice. So why is this particular issue one about which Paul insists on such unity? Why not instead say to the others of the community that they're being wrong to be scandalized? I think it boils down to a matter of the heart. There is nothing inherently wrong with eating meat sacrificed to idols, but when that practice is done out of pride and arrogance, it becomes out of bounds. When it threatens to undermine the faith of others in the community, it becomes out of bounds. Keep this in mind as we continue to read through 1 Corinthians. Pride, arrogance, condescension, these are corrosive elements for life in the church. As we will soon see, Paul has a better way to be church. Tomorrow, Paul will extend his argument and apply it more broadly, and in doing so, he makes mincemeat of one of our most cherished Western values. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.